All right, so we'll begin our next session. Uh, this is a session on jobs, and I've chosen a rather provocative title for it, The Future of Jobs and Jobs of the Future. Um, the background to this is that, the way Indian economy is, the way it has evolved, we have two extremes. Um, at one extreme, you have a lot of capital working with very little labor. And at the other extreme, you have a lot of labor working with almost no capital. Just to give you some sense with numbers, so 45% of India's workforce is in agriculture, 45%. Another 40% is in enterprises which have 9 or fewer workers. Many of these enterprises are, mom and pop operations, meaning, self-run, proprietorships, partnerships, where a lot of self-employment exists. But what you can see is that these are enterprises with 9 or fewer workers which employ 40% of the workforce. That's your 85% of workforce already there. Now, really, if you think of corporate India, the corporate India, which, at least one is thinking of enterprises with 200 workers or more, some reasonable size of enterprise, they employ only about 7 or 8% of the workforce. So here you got, at one extreme where largely it's capital and very few workers, and then you got the other extreme, we got lots and lots of workers but very little capital. And really the efficient allocation of the resources really requires you to be somewhere in the middle, where workers largely work with a fair bit of capital. And this is particularly true for a country like India, developing country, any country that's sort of, starting off with development, because it's a labor-abundant country. Capital is the scarce factor, labor is the abundant factor, and therefore you have to use your labor very effectively. And the way you use your labor very effectively is, have it work with some capital. Don't put your capital at one extreme and then leave virtually all the workforce without it. But this is how we started, you see. It's not where we stand today. It's not an accident, it's coming from the history. That initially when Nehru started implementing particularly the second 5-year plan, some of the foundations had been laid down even before the second 5-year plan, but second 5-year plan, which is 1955, his decision was that, we are going to do heavy industries, that this is the most important thing to do. And so, half of the public sector investment went into 3 steel mills. The remainder went into other machinery industries. So you really ended up with capital sitting in one place with very, very limited workers, and then all the workers who were supposed to produce all the light consumer goods were in cottage industries, village industries, household industries, very, very small enterprises with their own internal capital, which was hardly any. And so the only person who really got it right at that time, only a single economist who got it right at the time, and was absolutely nobody paid any attention whatsoever to him, was Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman wrote a memo in 1955 observing on this allocation of labor and capital that, at one extreme, capital is going to be very inefficient because it's not working with enough workers. At the other extreme, workers are going to be incredibly inefficient because they're working with no capital. And that structure that got embedded from the beginning actually still, now liberalization that happened post 1991 has made some difference. Some changes have happened, like we were about 60% in agriculture around 91, we are down to 45%, but that transition has been extremely slow. Just to give you an idea, over 30-year period from 91 on to today, 15 percentage points transition is all that has happened from agriculture into industry and services. South Korea, within the same 30 years from 1960 to 1990, had gone from about 70% to 20%. 50 percentage points just in 30 years. So this is a kind of transition that has not happened in India, as a result of which we have this sort of very, bimodal kind of distribution of these factors of production. So now this gives rise to a problem, which is, what is the future of jobs? Meaning that, look, at the end of the day, if this transition has to happen from agriculture into industry and services, good jobs which have some reasonably high productivity have to be created, to which these workers can then move. So that's one part of the problem. What are the jobs of the future, which will help India get to that transition? But the second part of the problem is that, of course, at the same time, India, having initially invested in these areas, so as we invested in heavy industries, we also invested in engineering, management, because it was a very planned idea that if we are going to have the heavy industries, you will need engineers, you will need management institutions. And so these institutions were created. And so we also have really got a part of our workforce, even if it's, might be 5%, but that's a lot of people. That's 20, 25 million people. They are in the cutting edge kind of jobs. And this is where the jobs of the future come in. So we have actually, between, I think, me, Pravin, and Poonam, we have expertise on the first set of issues. But we actually are very pleased today. We have also Prithwiraj Choudhury here, who works on these cutting edge jobs, the jobs of the future. And I'm very pleased to say that he was very recently included in the Forbes list of 50, which is a new list that Forbes started on experts or specialists on jobs of the future. So that's Prithwiraj Chauhan. He's Prithwiraj Choudhury. I've told, last night when we had dinner together, I said, in my part of the world, with Prithwiraj, only Chauhan goes, no Choudhury. So, yeah, he will appreciate that I was right. I was not joking with him. So he's a professor at Harvard University. Poonam Gupta, Dr. Poonam Gupta, I have already introduced her in the morning. She is the Director General of National Council on Applied Economic Research in Delhi, a real star on the Delhi circuit, and she's also a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. And last but not the least, my good friend and professor of international trade at Johns Hopkins, who holds the chair that once was held by Max Gordon at Johns Hopkins, Pravin Krishna. So the three of them have the charge of this session today. We will begin with an overview from Poonam.
Thanks for the opportunity again. I had 3 parts to my presentation. I'm keeping the last part to the Q&A if there is an interest. The first part is very much a macro perspective on employment and employment intensity of growth around the world, and some stuff on the states which are generating employment and the states which are generating surplus labor, a flavor of which we saw early this morning in the first session. So that's the first part of the presentation. A second part is presenting some results quickly from a report that we had done at NCER on the gig economy workers. If that is the future of jobs in a narrow sense, then what kind of jobs are being created specifically in food delivery platform workers? And I'll present some results from that. The part that I'm keeping away, and I'll see if there is an opportunity to take it up in response to some of the questions, are from my experiences being an employer now. The think tank which I head now has 120 people. In India, 120 is very much a middle-sized firm. We are not a manufacturing firm, we are a knowledge firm. But even so, there are interesting perspectives on jobs and employment and skills that we get, on which I would be happy to reflect if there is an opportunity. So India's employment landscape. India does not have unemployed people. India has underemployed people. If you look at the data and if you look at the rate of unemployment in India, it's rather low. It's only about 6%, and it has declined ever since in the last 2 years since COVID. What India has is, as Professor Panagariya mentioned, a huge proportion of its labor force employed in informal workforce, as casual labor, as self-employed or unpaid employees. So this large portion, which is self-employed, are very, very small enterprises, usually the individual himself or herself working, mostly himself, because women are largely missing from the labor force. At times with the unpaid help of a wife whose work does not get counted again. She's not a part of the labor force that gets counted. So this is where we are. Most of these people earn poorly. Those with informal employment or casual employment do not have job security. Those who are self-employed face all kinds of challenges, and they are not self-employed out of choice. They're self-employed out of compulsion because there's very little out there in the economy for them to be engaged with. But let's quickly look at, when we talk about employment, can we talk about employment devoid of economic growth? So what is the employment intensity of growth? Here we are looking at the global numbers. Indian numbers are not very different. So if the global growth is about 3 to 4%, employment growth is only about half to 1/3 of that. So at any given point in time, in any economy around the world, not a whole lot of employment gets generated. So just to keep that out there, that if India is growing at 6%, and if these numbers apply to India as well, India will generate employment only about 2.5% growth rate of employment. But there is an interesting sectoral distinction here in terms of which sectors generate employment and which sectors do not. Agriculture sheds labor, basically. Agriculture is all about productivity. The same amount of food and other things can be produced using fewer people. So in general, employment intensity of agriculture is negative, and the same case we see in India. Agriculture is shedding labor, and agriculture has been growing at an average rate of 3.5 to 4%, which means agriculture does not generate employment. What generates employment? Manufacturing does, or more broadly, industry does. Industry has two major components, manufacturing and construction. Manufacturing and construction are both labor intensive. Construction more labor intensive than manufacturing. These distinctions are important when we think about how to generate employment through growth in India. So construction generates a whole lot of employment. Manufacturing generates employment. The largest employment is generated by services. That has the highest employment intensity. There are two things that we need to remember about services. First, it's a very large and heterogeneous sector. It has all of those a large fraction of those self-employed people sitting there, being a hawker, selling vegetables or selling something small. And it also has the highest paid high-tech sector. So it's a very large segment of the global economy, of national economies, and it generates different kind of employment. In my mind, services sector also, in a way, overestimates the employment that it generates. When manufacturing sector generates employment, it generates a whole lot of demand, which gets counted in services. So services accounts for both direct and indirect employment that gets generated because of economic growth in agriculture and in industry. So these are some of the basic facts about the sectoral landscape of employment. Now, where does India stand? When we compare India with other countries, I have a select list of countries here, but representative nonetheless. India has a very large share of agriculture in GDP, as Professor Arvind Panagariya mentioned, and it has a smaller share of manufacturing in GDP compared to other countries, which is interesting and an anomaly which has then implications for our employment numbers. In addition, agriculture generates a whole lot of employment, which means people are underemployed, right? They are not productively employed in agriculture, which can do with nearly 1/3 of the people who are currently employed there. Manufacturing contributes 18% or thereabouts to GDP and employs about 12% of the total labor force. Look at construction. Construction accounts for 8% of GDP and employs about 12% of labor force. So this itself is problematic, and it requires some thinking, and it requires shifting people out of agriculture into much more productive employment elsewhere, be it manufacturing, be it formal services. Now, that is one part of the employment narrative. The other part is, where is employment spatially getting generated in India? So we saw that we see divergence in economic growth across Indian states. The richer states are the ones which are growing faster, and the poorer states are growing slower. In addition, leading states, I'm calling them richer states or leading states, their population growth is much smaller than the population growth of the lagging states. Populations in leading states is more educated. These states attract a larger share of FDI, and they are the ones who are doing much better and growing faster in both manufacturing and services. So these are the states which are generating good demand for labor. Lagging states, on the other hand, they are more concentrated in agriculture. They have much higher population growth rates. Their population is less educated, and they are the ones who are generating excess labor. So this question of how does employment get generated, or how do people get employed, a large part of that question has to be migration. So people have to migrate from these poorer states, lagging states, to the richer states. A lot of this migration is already happening, but perhaps not enough. Here, I'm just showing the charts which show that the states which had a larger initial share of primary sector in their GDP in 2010, the lagging states, are the ones which are experiencing faster growth rate in agriculture till date. And a similar phenomenon we see in manufacturing. Or in other words, agrarian states continue to remain relatively agrarian. States which are more advanced in manufacturing and services are continuing to retain that advantage in those sectors. Now I turn to the second part of my presentation, which is gig economy the future of jobs? And I think it was one of the first of this kind of service that we did at NCER. It was a funded project from a partner. Here what we did was we conducted a survey of nearly 1,000 food delivery platform workers during a short period of time. The survey was conducted in 28 cities, and it had representation from all major cities as well as different city types. And the results are striking. The results in a nutshell show that gig economy workers are not doing that job as a matter of choice, just as we see a lot of self-employed people or people underemployed in agriculture. It's a job that they do out of compulsion. So first, what are the demographics of the people who are working? The average age of all food delivery platform workers in our sample was 29. This is younger than the average age of all urban male workers, which is 39 in PLFS. So I'm saying male workers because nearly 100% of food delivery workers are male in India. They are moderately educated. 90% of these respondents had a education of class 10 and above. And actually, in tier 2 cities, a large percentage were college graduates who, for want of better work, were doing this. These platform work does generate jobs in tier 2 and tier 3 cities. These are locally generated jobs. Most of the workers were working in their hometowns. So I talked about migration. So workers are not migrating to a big city to be a food delivery worker. So most of these jobs are localized jobs. 1/3 of these people were unemployed before joining the platform. I don't know the exact percentage, if my memory is correct, about 25–30% were in between jobs. They lost their last job, and then they thought that rather than sitting at home, let me join this. So the average duration of unemployment before they joined this platform was 5 months. Uh, their gross earnings seems large compared to an average urban male workers, but it's actually much less than that of an average urban male worker if we account for operational expenses, because they have to use their own transport and they have to pay for fuels, and for the hours that they're working for, 69. When I read 69, I was reminded of Mr. Narayan Murthy's 70 hours. People are working 70 hours and they're not earning subsistence wages. So what do you tell them? You work more? Average monthly earnings, as I said, are about 21,000 rupees, but much less when you account for the number of hours, not just even number of hours, even for the operational expenses. And those earnings have remained stagnant in real terms in the last 4 years. So these are not great quality workers. Here we have comparison with the PLFS workers on the number of hours they're working and what they're earning. So just to sum it up, Indians are not unemployed, they are underemployed in informal sector, as casual labor, and in self-employment. Employment intensity of growth is much less than one around the world, which means that if India has to employ its large stock of underemployed labor, it has to grow much faster. And it has to generate that much faster growth in sectors which are more labor intensive. We have to find a way for people to migrate from lagging states to the leading states. Gig economy workers is creating only subsistence wages as of now. There is a role of policy here, shift towards manufacturing, shift towards more exportable activities, whether they are manufacturing or services. Maybe it's time to do away with that distinction between manufacturing and services, because there are parts of services which are quite similar to manufacturing. And given, again, the large stock of people that we have, we should focus on exporting not just goods and services, but also labor directly. We can be the skill capital of the world, and we are becoming skill capital of the world. And just one last slide on how the labor force is likely to grow in India. You may or may not appreciate the fact that population growth rate is actually declining quite rapidly. With a more or less stable workforce participation rate, our labor force, at least on an incremental basis, is not going to increase rapidly. So India's employment challenge is more of the stock, not the flow. The new labor force is better educated, healthier, better prepared perhaps for labor force. A bigger point is, how do you take your middle-aged workers, underemployed and so on, and make them employment ready? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak here. I should mention that when I left Washington yesterday, one of my colleagues asked me, what are you going to be talking about at the conference? And I said, it's going to be about labor markets, the structural transformation of India. And he said, isn't Professor Panagariya the expert on that? And I said, listen, and the economists in this audience will appreciate it, the students of economics. I said it was up to absolute advantage of knowledge on Indian topics, then Professor Panagariya would present on every single thing here. It's only because of comparative advantage that the rest of us, most of the rest of us, have an opportunity to say a thing or two. But thank you again. And in actuality, I think Professor Panagariya already did a very good job of kind of summarizing the broad arc of what it is that I sort of plan to say. And so most of what I'll be saying will be adding sort of points of detail, and I'll raise a few questions at the end about the jobs of the future. Okay. So the broad nature of the problem is I think, well known. India has a very young population. There's a very significant demographic pressure in terms of kind of job creation and the need to create good jobs. And the real question is, where are these good jobs going to be created? Is it going to be in agriculture? Is it going to be industry, services, and so on? And just closely related, this issue of, what's the broad nature of kind of, the structural transformation that India has already undergone? What is the future trajectory? What should it look like? What did other countries look like at comparable stages of their development? And are we on track, or are we sort of drifting off somewhere else? Okay, so first, agriculture is characterized by very low productivity, point that was already made. Over 45% of India's labor force is employed in agriculture. and it generates less than 15% of GDP. There's a very significant issue of scale in this discussion, which is that marginal farms, which are less than 1 hectare in size, and small farms, 1 to 2 hectares in size, account for 85% of the land holding. So there's a very strong contrast with sort of higher productivity areas in the world in the agricultural sector where these land holdings are obviously minuscule. And it's fairly obvious, I think, for us all to appreciate why scale would be important in achieving higher productivity. So on the one hand, sort of output per worker is low, productivity growth is also expected to be low, and that really means that certainly in relation to industry and services, that the GDP share will be falling. And so it's urgent then to have a transition out of agriculture into the other sectors, a point that Poonam Gupta made as well. The need for this you can see additionally by comparing sort of output per worker in other sectors, industry services, in relation to agriculture. So the numbers you're seeing are the ratios of kind of, output per worker, let's say in industry relative to agriculture, and you see that this is rising over time, right? So these figures are actually from a very excellent book by Professor Panagariya, India Unlimited, which makes the case very strongly that in addition to kind of low productivity, the relative productivities also suggest to you that there should be this type of transition out of agriculture into industry and services. If one looks at what other countries have gone through, this is U.S. Structural transformation. So you sort of see in the mid 1800s, sort of this kind of dark blue line there is agriculture. You had about 50% of output was in the agricultural sector, and then very sort of gently initially and then much more rapidly, you start to see a declining share of that. You see increases in manufacturing and, of course, a complete takeoff in services with the employment shares that mirror what you're seeing here in terms of the output shares, right? So if you ask the question, what fraction of the U.S. labor force is employed in producing agricultural output, it's going to be 1%, 1.5%, something of that nature. A very, very small number compared to what's going on in India. The point about South Korea was brought up earlier as well. So this is what South Korean manufacturing employment share looked like as it went through these impressive stages of its own growth. You see it sort of rising from 5-7% in the mid-1960s to 25-30% in manufacturing by the time you get to late 1980s, early 1990s, and then a bit of decline after that as they move on to other activities in the economy. By contrast, what you're seeing, despite sort of many decades of liberalization and quite an impressive liberalization, in India is a relative stagnation of Indian manufacturing kind of sectoral output shares. These are the bottom bars, the ones in the bright blue, are relatively constant, right? So you're really not seeing that kind of increase in manufacturing share. If you look at share of manufacturing in total output and employment over time, these are very flat lines here. If you look at formalization, what is the share of registered manufacturing in total output employment over time, that's also relatively flat. So by all measures, whether you're looking at output share, employment shares, formalization, the picture is not great, right? So especially in sort of in light of the fact that the economy itself has undergone a very dramatic and, in fact, quite impressive liberalization over the years. One of the reasons that, so as much as there was a table earlier which I showed you with numbers of 4, 5, and 6, and so forth. These are kind of the average productivity differences between agriculture, kind of the ratio of industry average productivity to agricultural average productivity. That is not a reflection of the marginal productivity, right? So if a worker moved from the farm to the factory, what are you going to be making is not reflected by that number 5, right? In part because what you're seeing is transitions potentially of workers from low productivity small farms into low productivity small firms, right? So this is the transition there is not, you're not capturing this average number, you're getting more the marginal number, which is, as was already pointed out again, a low productivity sort of space. You have unorganized manufacturing accounting for over 70% of the employment and less than 20% of the output. And nearly 85% of the unorganized enterprises are part of what are called the OAEs, the own account enterprises, which hire no workers at all on a regular basis, right? So if you look at, these are figures from a paper done at NCAEER by Radhika Kapoor. If you look at sort of the employment shares, let's say you look at the employment shares relative to the output shares and focus on the figures for 2014, 2015, there's a very large fraction of employment that's in these kind of unorganized sectors. And then if you look at the fraction of the output that's being generated, it's much, much larger in the organized sectors. It's 80% relative to about 20% in the unorganized, right? So you have a problem of lack of productivity. The unorganized sector is very small. And there's no great surprise then, perhaps, that the transitions away from agriculture into manufacturing have not been so easy, in the sense that the wages have been well documented in a variety of settings, global settings, to be very closely related to firm size. And so you have here work from by Rana Hassan and co-author showing sort of in a bunch of different countries here, Indonesia, Korea, and so on, wage differentials across firm sizes, because average wages in firms of different size. And so as you get to the left of the distribution here, very small firms, very low wages. And so what it is that a kind of a small firm can potentially offer to a factory, a farm worker transitioning out of farms into factories is not going to be necessarily that attractive, and therefore a problem. This is just more on the same topic in a sense, which is that the firm size distribution within manufacturing is very heavily skewed towards kind of very small firms. And I should mention, I don't have a chart or figure here to show you, but if one looks at exporting activity, for example, right? So there's a lot of emphasis in Indian policy discussions about the small and medium enterprises and how one should be supporting small and medium enterprises and so forth. But if you look at other measures, let's say, what fraction of exports are being accounted for by SMEs and so on, it's actually astonishing that you would find almost 80, 90%. Let's say there's 100,000 registered exporters in India in any given year. Of that 100,000 number, the fraction of their kind of exports that are account for 90% of the fraction of the overall exports are accounted for by maybe the top 500 firms out of the 100,000, right? So it's really the largest firms that are doing most of it. And for most part, this is no great surprise either. If you look at kind of cross-country comparisons, there's kind of tends to be a density on the right end of the distribution. The only surprising thing in the Indian context is that there's so much policy emphasis still, wrongly, on kind of maybe promoting upscale, the things on the left side of this, which is the small scale firms. Alongside this, the other issue that has impeded the transformation away from agriculture into manufacturing is the choice of capital-intensive production techniques. So if you look at these are from the formal manufacturing sector, you see increases in the capital-labor ratio. This speaks to the earlier point about the fact that the reality is that India is a country with a very large labor force that is low-skilled. And all of what you're seeing here is an indication that we have ultimately failed to grasp our competitive advantage, and essentially kind of focused whatever production is taking place in manufacturing. The trend there seems to be more towards the utilization of capital relative to low-skilled labor, which is obviously hugely problematic. So the key challenges to transformation are fairly straightforward in agriculture: too many workers in relation to the GDP share, too many of them on tiny farms. The scope for increase in agricultural output is there, but limited by a variety of factors. In industry, you have a preponderance of capital and skilled labor-intensive sectors, also in services. The most prominent examples of kind of service sector growth are all kind of in highly skilled intensive services. The employment concentration, however, is in kind of micro, small enterprises, which are characterized by low productivity. The issue that a number of economists have been discussing alongside all of this is relevant in the Indian context, but also elsewhere, has to do with technological change, right? So you have skill-biased technological change taking place. You have a kind of a desire on the part of, in the Indian context, owners of firms and so on to move towards more capital-intensive production techniques, what does that actually mean for sort of labor demand ultimately? This problem is further sort of compounded or perhaps potentially accelerated by artificial intelligence, things of that nature, which really bring into question the future of jobs, right? So it's not clear to me, at least, that AI and things of that nature are immediate threats to kind of the India story. But the same point is relevant here, which is that the worry about AI in kind of the medium run even is that the average productivity of wherever AI is involved is going to potentially be increased. But what's going to happen to the marginal product of the worker? What's going to happen to the wage rate of the worker? What's going to happen to the division of that rent, the output that is going to be between the owners of the AI, the owners of the robots, and so forth, and how much is going to be left over for workers? The interesting twist is that unlike a simple substitution between capital and labor that you could worry about, and that's still relevant in the Indian context, where you would rather have a kind of a more productive machine than an unskilled worker. In principle, AI could be, or AI-driven sort of production technologies could be substituting away not just unskilled workers, but semi-skilled and perhaps even highly skilled workers, depending on the nature of production and the nature of that productive activity. So these are questions. I certainly don't have any answers for those, but I'm hoping that our King Emperor here, Prithwiraj Chauhan, will get on stage and shed some light on what the future holds.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Panagariya, and Ruchir also for inviting me. So, and trust me, I've been called Prithwiraj Chauhan many times in my life, sometimes even Prithwiraj Kapoor, but less frequently. So I'm going to focus on two questions in my talk. So the first is, what is the potential impact of AI and machine learning on the future of jobs? And then we have talked a lot today about the spatial distribution of talent, and we have talked about migration. So I'm going to share some research on how firm practices, management practices within firms that relate to hiring and remote work might affect the spatial distribution of talent in India. So the first question is on machine learning and jobs. And I'm just curious, how many of us think about whether AI is going to substitute for our jobs? Just a show of hands. Okay, so I definitely think about it. So this is a study, it's an RCT, to the best of my knowledge, one of the first RCTs which look at this question. So I don't have time to go through the formal model, but let me just share the intuition. So when we think about machine learning and workers, the argument is that there are two countervailing mechanisms in play. So one, there is the effect of domain expertise, that unless you have the domain expertise, and Pravin talked about skill-biased technical change, we are also motivated by the vintage-specific human capital literature, Chari and Hoppenheim. So unless you have the domain expertise, you will not be able to use this technology like any other technology in a productive way. But then the countervailing mechanism is, imagine a true expert, someone who has domain expertise. And there's a newly emerging literature at the boundary of economics and computer science, which is showing that there is a lot of algorithmic aversion, the aversion of using machine learning tools, especially among experts. So that's the sort of and the prediction is then you'll get a curvilinear relationship where the people who might benefit from machine learning tools are actually mid-career people. So not the novices, not the true experts, but in the middle. So this is an experiment we ran with an Indian technology company because they deeply care about this. So this is HCL Technologies. And so what we did is they have created a machine learning tool to predict what algorithm should be run to solve IT tickets. So when the server is down or you have a computer problem, they used to manually solve those problems. They have developed a machine learning tool which can now automate that process. So we took that tool and we had a random sample of employees and we gave them 8 problems to solve, 4 of them manually, 4 of them using the machine learning tool in a random order. So I'll just cut to the chase. What we find here is evidence of that curvilinear relationship. So we find on the panel to the right that when you think about the tickets that were solved using machine learning, we find evidence that the correctness rate was higher for the mid-career people. there was no such effect when folks were solving this manually. Now the question is then, what are the mechanisms? So this is just the regression results. So I'm going to skip this. The mechanism on the left tail, the folks who had very little domain experience, was that they just could not solve the harder tickets. And so this is classic Chari and Hoppenheim. So that's what we sort of build on. On the right, we didn't have an empirical proof of the algorithmic aversion. So we did a lot of field interviews, and I'll just share one quote here. So this really experienced person, she's saying that, yes, I know this might be the correct solution for this problem, but if I hit accept, it might put that server up, but might have a problem on 3 other servers down the line. So there was a lot of unintended consequences they were thinking of, which may or may not be correct, but we clubbed them as evidence of algorithmic aversion. So I think the takeaway, this is just one study, this is one Indian IT company. We need lots of more research. But I think in the immediate term, if you just take this study, it seems that our jobs are safe, and the people who might benefit might be the people who have some domain experience, but have not become averse because they are experts. So that's one study I wanted to share. Then I'll just quickly go through some other research I've done on how management practices, such as hiring migrants and remote work, which I've been studying for a while, and we can chat on coffee breaks why, even before the pandemic, I was studying remote work, might affect the spatial distribution of talent. So this is a study we concluded recently looking at brain drain for the elite talent, and this is a sample of IIT engineers. So we collected their career histories over a long period of time, and I think there's a nice natural experiment we exploit in the study. So there is the experiment where IT BHU suddenly became an IIT. And so what we did is we collected the data of folks who were enrolled in BHU before the IIT designation and compared their migration rates to people before and after. But I think the summary stat is telling the story that the migration rate is much higher for people who got into IIT versus who had an IIT rank very, very close to getting into an IIT but didn't get through. And so, this sample, of course, includes myself, Pravin, Viral, a lot of us. But the question I ask is it brain drain, or, Devesh Kapoor would say this is brain circulation. And I have some evidence along those lines too. So in a different study, which I don't have results here, we show that the Indian Microsoft R&D operations were completely incubated by 16 return migrants. And I think the most interesting result of that paper is the folks that these returnees hired, the local Indian employees that these returnees hired, after the returnees retired or left, these first batch of Indians became the disproportionate power brokers in Microsoft Indian R&D. So I think there was a transfer of tacit knowledge from the returnees to the domestic migrants. So there is an argument for brain circulation, not brain drain. I thought I'll show this study on how the spatial distribution of talent is not only about moving talent from smaller districts and smaller towns to the larger metros, but even sending some of our best talent from the metros to these smaller areas. So this is a study I did with the IAS officer, the career history of IAS bureaucrats. And so, folks might know here that the assignment of IAS officers to states there is some randomness in this, and Lakshmi Iyer has used that in a different paper. So we follow the same identification strategy. And the main result we find in the paper is that as the first posting, if you went to a small remote part of India, then you had a quicker, or your promotion rates both in the short term and the long term were faster. And this, and both the short term and the long term. And then we've tested this result using multiple, so what is that smaller district really, measuring? So we've used crime rate, we've used mineral ore deposits, and then I interviewed a large number of IAS officers. And one story I'll quickly share. So I interviewed this lady, Sumita Daura, who was also the ambassador to China. And she said her first posting was to Karimnagar, which is a Naxalite district in Telangana. And she said going there made me think out of the box. So I had to visit the local villages in cars with fake number plates. And then she started a Angadwadi school there. And the way she did it was to employ the daughters and the wives of the Maoists. So, and she said, sitting in Mumbai or sitting in Bangalore, I would have never got that kind of skill development. So this is just an argument to saying that our kids from the cities should go and spend some time in these more remote places. The other argument of moving talents, so Ruchir talked about this in the morning, from smaller towns to larger cities. So I've done a study on this. And this is with Infosys. So Infosys, among all the Indian companies, hires widely across India, 250 colleges in our sample. And for some abstruse reason, they randomly assign these people to 10 production centers, which really helps us as economists. But the main finding of the study is that we find that the folks coming from the third-tier towns have better performance than everyone else. And we then looked at what kinds of towns, and we found that the towns with least opportunities, those workers were performing better. But there's also an interesting caveat here. They were also more likely to leave for competitors more faster. And we saw that during the time they spent in Infosys, they were focusing on skill augmentation, especially learning English. So there were self-selected courses that you could take on developing skills, and these third-tier city people, they were disproportionately enrolling in these courses to learn English. So I thought this might be interesting to this audience. And then finally, this has become my life since the pandemic. I've been studying remote work, especially this form of remote work that I've called work from anywhere, which allows workers to migrate and live where they want to live instead of living in a city because the company has an office. So this is not an Indian study. I did this study before the pandemic with the US Patent Office. And here too, there's a natural experiment I'll skip. But the main finding is we find that productivity went up 4.4%. And the argument I've made in lots of follow-up research is this evolution of work from anywhere might be a key mechanism for smaller towns and rural areas to draw talent. So I've been working with the community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for years now, and they have been able to attract about 2,500 families so far, all of them working remotely. And we are observing lots of positive effects, more volunteering in the local community, more entrepreneurial startups being started of all kinds, food stalls, restaurants, small grocery stores, daycare centers. So I think this might be an opportunity. Remote work might be an opportunity for the smaller towns in Bihar or Uttar Pradesh or all over India to get some talent back, because I'm guessing there's a tremendous amount of brain drain from these smaller towns. The one reason why they're not catalyzing into tier 1 is because all the young people are leaving. But remote work might be able to break that cycle. So that's all I had. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. So let me begin first, Raj, asking you just a clarifying question. In this study that you did of the IAS officers being employed in the remote districts or towns for their first placement, do you also try to check the correlation between such placement and maybe some characteristics, like maybe these are the most talented of the officers in the first place, and they have, and somehow that within the system there is a way to select them out and send them out to the most remote places, so that it has really nothing to do with them being employed in the remote places, but it is a result of the fact that they were, to begin with, the most talented officers.
Well, thank you. Yeah, so our finding is that based on observables, we didn't find any difference. And because they're just starting their careers, and we are building on this prior paper by Lakshmi Iyer, and it's a complicated set of rules. So as you know, there is the home cadre and there is other states. And my understanding is if your home state is not demanding for an IAS officer, then you can go to any other state in India. They're listed alphabetically. And so the argument is that there is some quasi-randomness in how you are allocated to these states.
Okay. All right. So now I'm going to throw in a bit of difficult questions. I don't know the answers to these either. But I thought the question is so important that all of us should really think about these questions. So let me first say, one difficult question that I struggle with is that, given the fact that so many workers are in agriculture and so many workers are also in these micro and small enterprises, the political economy is really set up to continue to reproduce that in the following sense. That if you are a politician wanting to win an election, where are my voters? Well, they are either in agriculture or in micro and small enterprises. So I do things, good things for the farmers. I try to do good things for the micro and small enterprise employees. That, of course, also means that I'm doing good things to keep them where they are, even though that may not be my intent. But that's the effect of it. And take, for example, there is a natural kind of instinct that, there's output expansion is happening, GDP is growing 7-8%. It's happening mostly in the corporate India and so forth. So I think there is a very clear case for redistribution. So I say, well, I'll bring some of the prosperity that's being generated there to where you are, right? So I bring the, you don't need to move. I'll bring all the good stuff to you. So it's the political economy in this sense really set up for us not to transform. I mean, if I do the comparison with, say, the really fast transformers, at least in the case of South Korea, Taiwan, and even Singapore, there were no such redistributions happening. It was all, the entire transformation was the result of very rapid growth with very rapidly rising wages. When I mentioned earlier that South Korea, from about 68% share in agriculture of the workforce, it fell to about 18%, 50 percentage points in 30 years' time. But while this was happening, so much workers were being absorbed in industry and services, real wages were also rising 9 to 10% a year. You didn't need to do anything else, because when real wages are rising 9 to 10% a year, and so many workers are being absorbed into industry and services, all transformation is happening. Now, that's the sort of thing that is not happening here. So what I do is, well, my output growth is happening here. I'll tax these guys, get some revenues, bring these to you. Is that something? And if you think that's a serious sort of explanation of what is happening of the political economy, is there a way out of it? That's the question. And as I said, I don't have the answer. So it's a curveball.
Well, in general, questions about politics are above the pay grade of an economist. But let me just say that if the productivity differential, and therefore the wage differential between farms and factories was large enough, which it's not necessarily in the present situation, but if it was, meaning you really had highly productive factories, as was the case with South Korea, as was the case with China and so on, then some tinkering on the margin by politicians or whoever to redistribute and so on, it might dampen the flow, but perhaps not completely stop it. So, I mean, the underlying problem that we've all talked about today of the lack of productive or highly productive jobs in the factories is still going to be a factor, right? And then I think on the margin, redistributions make a difference, and political intent to maintain the voter base and a certain sort of status quo so they can be manipulated. I imagine all these factors would be there, but I don't think, well, I at least don't, I hope that it's not the case that they could completely overwhelm what would be a true productivity difference that would normally incentivize a worker to leave a factory, a farm and go to a factory.
So, Professor Panagariya, in my mind, it's only a partially a political economy issue, and that fraction is not very large either to maintain the status quo. So the 2 or 3 different things that are coming to my mind. Protecting the farmer, protecting the rural way of life is more of an ideological and emotional issue for Indians. Indians respect certain jobs and certain occupations, teachers and doctors and defense workers and farmers. So the moment you say that people should move to the urban areas more, there is very little rate of return to spending money in a sparsely populated rural area does not go down well at all. So just as being rich used to be a bad word earlier, being too urban and too modern is not a good word either. So there is a more of an emotional sense to maintain the status quo, not necessarily to protect, to not promote manufacturing. That's one thing. Second, on manufacturing, India has been trying really hard for the past 30 years. Now, most Indian politicians and policymakers do not know what else to do. And they have not succeeded. So they do not want to disrupt the existing model without knowing what more we can do in disruption for the sake of disruption. Where it is a political economy issue is when it comes to taxing the agriculture, right? That is very much a political issue, that agriculture should not be taxed, but it's not that jobs should not be taken out and created elsewhere. And the best example of that is that there are certain states which are able to industrialize and industrialize well. So if it was a political economy issue, they would not have been able to make this transformation either.
Could I just say one thing which is in support of your theory, Arvind, which is, and the Bangaloreans and people from Karnataka can probably confirm or reject this, but I do remember reading and hearing the argument that as Bangalore started to really accelerate as a center for IT and so on, that the political authorities were not quite so keen for Bangalore to grow as quickly relative to the rest of the state. And so the choke off of the infrastructure and the lack of willingness to support it, which was anticipated back then already, and now you're seeing the full effects of that support not being provided. But that was almost an intentional thing, not to have the rest of the state feel left behind relative to these, IT workers with their pubs and bars and whatever, having a great time in the city. This is a kind of redistribution of the sort that you're talking about, right? So let me not facilitate high productivity jobs so that the others don't feel left behind and then punish me in elections for that reason. So I'm not sure whether this is true or false, or what the relevance is in other contexts outside this one.
So the first thing I'll say is that if you don't have the answer, then we don't have the answer. But let me just brainstorm a couple of things. So, one thing that probably could be debated is whether preserving that rural farming way of life, whether the incentives can be given to the children of these people. And the thing that comes to my mind immediately is how the temporary migrants in China, who all moved north to south and worked from that July to January timeframe, were young women, and they went back to their families. There's a very interesting study that a Stanford economics PhD student is working on, where she's showing that the wives of the workers in the Dharavi slum, they are, when incentivized, they're taking remote jobs to do simple coding exercises on MTurk. And they were, earlier they were doing nothing. So I wonder if these new practices can unlock talent that is completely not working today, or the younger, people in the family.
So in effect, connect them remotely, if not bringing them physically into the urban industrial workforce. That's certainly. And to pursue this a little bit further, I think it's just these are just difficult questions. But ultimately, to me, it seems that looking for answers to these questions is the most important thing we can do. Another puzzle, why is it that in a country which is so labor abundant and capital scarce, why is it that the entrepreneurs seem to continue to invest in these very highly capital or skilled labor intensive industries? You look at what the successful industries in India are from the output perspective, and you see, well, IT industry is doing well, the machinery industry is doing well, chemical industry is doing well, pharmaceuticals is doing well, Um, Petroleum refining. India's number one export is actually the refined petroleum, which probably employs only capital, and the only workers they employ are these security workers, most likely, nothing else. It's so automated. Why is it that this outcome, in spite of all the reforms that have been done, continues to repeat itself, continues to reproduce? And this is where I feel that, somehow, so if we could know what the reason is, we could get somewhere, but the implication of that kind of investment, that structure of investment is that the cost of capital for anybody else who would be employing a lot more workers per unit of capital is simply too high. Now the example here is apparel industry, which has a much greater labor intensity, meaning employment intensity for per unit of capital investment. To just give you an idea, 45% in apparel industry, labor cost is about 45% of the total cost. In two-wheeler industry, I'm not even talking four-wheeler automobiles, two-wheeler industry, labor cost, all the way from the CEO down to the watchman, are about 4%. Now, in a country which is 500 million plus workers, why is there not an incentive to go into sectors where you can employ many more workers per unit of capital and therefore actually get a very high return on capital? We would think that that ought to give you, with that many workers working on small amount of capital, ought to give you a very good return on capital. But why does that not happen?
At some point, I got in touch with your former student, Rana Hassan, who was interested in this type of a question: why isn't there more expansion of manufacturing, low-skill manufacturing in India? And he had conducted sort of many hours-long surveys of individual entrepreneurs and owners of various firms in India. And when I spoke to him to find out what he found out, right? What was it that he got at the end of this? I was expecting that he would say something about Indian regulations or labor laws or something along these lines. And he said, actually, it's a completely confusing picture. Not everyone's saying something different. And one entrepreneur is talking about how his kids don't want to get involved and dirty their hands with these businesses of the past, that they want something in the future, digital technology and so forth. And I wasn't even sure whether to believe Rana, but I asked him to send over the survey so I could look at them myself. And he was completely right. It's a very confusing picture. Meaning, on the one hand, there's a fraction of entrepreneurs who are talking about sort of these doing business with type factors for why they can't expand, some land restrictions or labor or something else. But that might have been just about 10% of the people who spoke. The remaining 90 had a list of reasons that was extraordinary and complicated, and sometimes they didn't even know the answer themselves. I recall Rana asked the question even to a very large, I think it was maybe Shahi, to why they don't double their scale, because they're already so large, they know how to perform at a large scale. And in principle, the opportunities in international markets were so open for Indian expansion, and did not get a very clear answer for why that's the case. So it's actually a genuine puzzle, whether it's a cultural matter or a regulatory one or some generational shift of some sort. But I'm not sure that there's a very clear answer that's available.
So let me still try to push this a little bit further. So there's still one area of reform. Well, there's two areas of reform where one can still pinch a little bit of hope. I just want to get your reactions, whether whether holding hope is something that is realistic. Let's put it that way. The two areas are, one, the labor reform still has not happened. Although the labor laws, 4 labor codes have been passed, which would go some distance, not full distance, towards fixing the inflexibility in labor markets, particularly with respect to the decisions on laying off workers. Under the current law, it's very, very difficult for any entrepreneur of any size, 100 workers or more, to lay off the workers. And to some degree, at least, that problem will be fixed once these new labor laws, which have been enacted by the parliament but have not been implemented yet. And it'll probably have to wait till the election afterwards. I think soon after it should happen. So that's one area where I think, at least I see some hope that possibly currently when your 45% of your costs are labor costs, and you know that there is no easy exit out, right? So supposing you have to actually close down your enterprise completely, how do you exit if you cannot fire the workers? So that is still a sort of a lingering problem. So that's one. The other one seems to me is also in the labor markets. Land market. The land in India is incredibly expensive, and it is also very, very difficult for the private buyers of land to buy a large tract of land, because often these pieces of land are owned by different people. And if you're looking for a piece which is at, say, 100 acres or so, you got to buy land from many different pieces and put them together. And what that does is, then are the land rights themselves well-defined land ownership rights? And there are no titles as in America to land and houses. And so often there are pieces of land within that 100 acres that you're looking for, which have all kinds of encumbrances. The owner is not clear, there are three people claiming the ownership of that. And so it becomes very difficult. So that could very well be also the fact that the land is so expensive. And certainly, when land is overly expensive, your calculation for example, rental housing goes completely out the window, because rents that people can afford in the city are just not enough to cover the mortgage payments on the housing that you otherwise would create. So is there some optimism there? Hope there that if those reforms happen?
Yes, I think so. And I'm a student of yours, so some part of that learning was the eternal optimism. But when one looks at a very narrow sector, let's just look at textiles and apparel, and you know these figures better than me. The Chinese, who are fierce competitors in that space, have exited, and declining market share of China. So tremendous opportunity for us to expand. The Bangladeshis have gotten in there, the Vietnamese have gotten in there, and India's share, as far as I can tell, has not moved even by 0.1%. So it's quite remarkable that the kind of the lack of elasticity in that sense. So on the one hand, if we were talking about why hasn't India gone from 3% of the apparel share in the market to 12%, and then there are big issues of this sort, that would be, maybe there are some constraints of that sort, but why hasn't it moved at all? It's quite dramatic. And maybe there's something here in terms of the particular sorts of issues, the cost of land, labor regulations, and so forth. But somehow I fear that it's something deeper than that, and that the answer is worse than that, and that these are not easy fixes somehow. I don't know.
Poonam, Raj?
So I agree with Pravin. We may not have reformed the labor and land markets fully, but we have been trying in incremental ways for a full 30 years. And we have not increased our share of manufacturing in GDP. And I think, as Pravin said, answer lies that these are very hard activities to specialize in. We are looking only at the labor cost, but there are other costs attached to it, to being an enterprise in low-skilled intensive manufacturing. You spend a large share of your production cost on logistics, on storage, on transport, and you're competing with some of the global best suppliers. So if by just amending your labor and land laws, if you're not going to become globally competitive still, why would an entrepreneur enter that space. So when it comes to manufacturing, you don't compete with just yourself and with your past, you compete with the global best, and that's a very tall order. When you combine all the different costs of, you need the scale, and scale is something that's very hard to get in India. And all the newer, younger people, all the startups are in technology intensive companies. So unskilled labor manufacturing, as of now, even with land and labor, may not fructify for us.
Wow, that's very pessimistic.
I'll just add. So on a more optimistic note, I'll add a very quick point. So Poonam talked about gig workers, and there's a fascinating book that Sandeep Suri et al. At Microsoft have written on the M-Turkers and how many of them are from India. And I wonder whether also policy needs to be focused on the gig workers and giving them training and benefits and just to further incentivize people to leave whatever they're doing and think of these sectors as sustainable employment options.
That's good. So two more questions, and then we'll open up. It's okay. We'll take a little bit longer than we are scheduled here. The ambassador would be coming soon. So just two last questions. One, so the government of India has been doing this subsidy scheme called the Production Linked Incentives, PLI. Then it seems to be very focused actually on industries very much that are capital intensive, technology intensive industries. Would it make a difference to simply sort of reconfigure this subsidy towards the much more labor intensive industries and perhaps break the jinx a little bit by heavily subsidizing maybe for 5 years the some of the very labor intensive sectors? I mean, is that something that might change the thinking,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some value to a demonstration effect type of sort of thinking there. Certainly, the entry of a company like Apple to start production in India, even if the value-added activity that's taking place in India is a really small fraction of the overall value of output, and even if most of that is actually being covered by the Indian subsidy, so essentially we're paying for all of what Apple is doing in India, there's still some value, I think, from the standpoint of our comparison with China, from the standpoint of our comparison with ourselves in the past, that we've shown ourselves to be a place where a large, highly sophisticated player like Apple wants to set up production, and does so successfully. So if that demonstration sort of effect works in that end of the distribution, then maybe there's some value there of thinking along those lines in kind of the labor-intensive industries as well, whether they're international or domestic, to just sort of demonstrate that very large-scale production that really has an impact in terms of expanding our footprint and market share in global markets that actually works, and that there are major success stories that others could emulate. So yes, maybe some optimism there.
So I agree, Professor Panagariya, it's a risk worth taking, but it should not be a substitute for all the other reforms that you're talking about. Because what we have done in the last 30 years is we have really taken small incremental efforts. Remember, there was a time when certain activities were reserved for small-scale reservation. We removed those, but we kept many other things. So similarly now, land and labor reforms plus subsidy, very specifically targeted, with the sunset clause perhaps, and equally available to domestic as well as foreign investors, can make this final leap that we are looking for. But one quick thought is that many of the impediments that we are talking about were already relaxed in the special economic zones. But even then we didn't succeed in manufacturing. So we are really talking about giving the environment that was given in SEZs plus plus. So what would that plus plus be? Is it the availability of talent? labor and land laws were already relaxed, or is it actually now outright subsidies? But I think it's a risk worth taking. The only other thing is the fiscally, what do you displace? You add it to your fiscal cost, which is not going to be possible. So what do you displace by giving this subsidy? Politically, it would be a very easy thing to do. Politically, nobody questions if you are expanding fiscally, right? If you are giving subsidies like this. So.
All right. My last question to you, Raj. So there was this short interview between Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk. And one of the questions Rishi Sunak asked was, what will be the future of our jobs? Very much the question that you work on. And if I understood correctly, Elon Musk's answer, it was that, well, those who want to work will have the work to do, but those who don't want to work can simply have the robots do it. That seemed to go very much in the opposite direction of where you seem to come out on this, that, well, if we choose not to work, there will be no issue. Plenty of robots will do everything that needs to be done in the future at some point in time. Why do you think that you are right and Elon Musk is wrong?
Elon Musk is probably right, but I think the time frame. So two things I'll add. So first of all, David Otter, of course, has done a lot of work on this, and he talks about skill polarization, how there'll be jobs in the left tail and the right tail of the talent distribution, and the middle is going to get substituted. But even there, on the left tail, the argument is that if you're plucking fruit, then the robotic arm is not good enough today. But I've seen some proof of concepts which are absolutely, cutting edge. And so in an Amazon warehouse right now, the robots are driving down, the people are still plucking things, but there are robotic arms which can do as well as humans. So maybe that left tail is getting squeezed too. On the right tail too, with generative AI, I think there's going to be more jobs that could be done, using AI and automation. But I think one thing I'll add here, which I find fascinating. So the theory that I'm working on right now is, borrowing from a branch of computer science, which they call adversarial machine learning. And the idea is that if in any transaction there is a human on one end, then you need a human on the other end. And I'll give you an example from my research. So when you think about a patent application, there is a human lawyer that is writing the application, and there is a human examining that patent. And so the reason you cannot take the human patent examiner out and put a machine learning is that the human lawyer has incentives to not be truthful in the application. And the way they do it, it's a fascinating story. The patent office actually allows the patent applicants to be their own lexicographer. So you can invent new words to define your invention. So you can, and one example I give my students is, there's a patent which uses the term Christmas tree to describe a deep oil exploration cable. Now, why Christmas tree? No reason. I just like Christmas tree. And there is no machine learning algorithm which has been using the training data set of the past, which will know that Christmas tree means something to do with oil exploration. So the argument is, in resumes, in insurance claims processing, whenever there's a human on one side of the transaction, you need a human on the other side of the transaction, maybe helped by machine learning. You cannot take the human completely away.
That's optimistic. Thank you.
If I could add one thing, Arvind, if I could add one thing to the Elon Musk story. The reason that he was smiling when he responded to Rishi Sunak is because he left the question unanswered as to who would own the robots. And that's partially because he thinks he might be the one who owns them all, and then so he's going to be doing very well of their efforts.
And so you think he has a moral hazard there to just get Rishi Sunak to think along those lines, huh? All right. Okay. So we start. Deepak, did you have? We welcome. Absolutely.
It's really sort of a big picture kind of a question, and maybe it's a potential subject for our next conference or part of it. Every time I go to India, I come back so excited. So much going on. People's aspirations are through the roof. The economy has this feel to it. Planes are full, roads are getting built. I mean, so why is this not getting reflected in all the data? When you dig through this, I mean, what you're saying, employment is not doing much better, right? You have UP and Bihar still pulling things back. Why is that? And is there like a prescription? And I can understand all the stuff, by the way, in terms of the components of it. But is there 3 or 4 or 5 things that we should be doing, which we are not, to see why is, the common, and I'm not saying elitist view, by the way. I mean, when I look at the middle class in India now, I mean, they're going to restaurants and spending $5,000 on dinner and stuff like that. They're driving nice cars. So why don't we see that reflected in what you have?
Panelists.
The macroeconomist.
Not the macroeconomist, but somebody who now lives in India. Yes. So you're absolutely right. There is a huge amount of optimism all around. And this optimism, I'm just reporting from the cities as of now. I don't go to the rural areas. I just read about them. And, we are growing nominally at 11%. In any case, so maybe this is the exuberance associated with 11%, but this nominal growth, 11%, is good growth. As we had this discussion in Delhi, there is optimism about the future, there is more trust on the government, there is trust that we pay a huge amount of taxes. I mean, I'm realizing how much taxes I pay now, but I know that my taxes are being put to good use. There is political stability, there is macroeconomic stability. All of this is adding up. Having said that, Deepak, the way you feel, not many people, not everybody feels that way. There are conferences happening in parallel elsewhere where they'll say India is shrinking, India is not even growing at 0%, right? But the ground reality is when I was in the US earlier, when I would come back to the US after a few months, I would see churning. Oh, there used to be a store here. Now there's something else. This place is looking fancier. Now you see the dynamism in Delhi. Some other people had gone from the US working at Brookings, and they mentioned exactly the same thing. For this individual, he said progression of a society is when middle income starts eating outside. Everybody eats outside now, not just middle income, lower middle income. And my housekeeper and her husband, the couple works for us. They own a car. They come to work as a driver and a cook in a car. And Sundays are off. They work 6 days a week. And that is when they are doing, watching movies, eating out, visiting families. So there is a huge amount of progression all around. And perhaps it's 11%, and perhaps we are growing faster and we are not capturing it. Or perhaps it's optimism about the future.
Deepak, can you just take that?
Sure. And I was just saying, I went to college in Kanpur, and we had a Golden Jubilee celebration this year. And I asked the director, what is going on with the student body? And he said, when I graduated, half the class went overseas, right? He says now 5 to 10% of the class goes overseas, and 30% go into startups. And this is not meant to be an elitist comment at all, but the graduating class, the offers they get, I mean, they are like, 10,000 times more than what I was getting offered, right? I mean, so it just seems, once again, I mean, maybe this is a bubble, that we look at. Maybe we don't go to the rural areas enough and try to figure it out. But I don't know. I don't know how we captured this optimism and enthusiasm of the people. Maybe some metrics we ought to look at. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. So, in this session, we are just getting the pessimism out of the way first. In the next session, we return to very optimistic tone. Here.
Thank you for your presentations. So I actually had done some research about the textile industry previously as a part of a consulting firm, and I was trying to understand where does India fit in the competitiveness, in terms of the competitiveness in the textile industry, in terms of Vietnam, Bangladesh, and it's a very low margin products that we're selling. So the minor differences in costs actually count. And sometimes those differences in costs, which we're actually losing the competitiveness is from the labor costs. So our labor laws are probably stricter than, like, say, for example, Bangladesh, which could be possibly a good thing because we're protecting our labor. In that sense, is that one of the reasons why possibly we should be, like, our new age entrepreneurs should be shifting their focus away from these traditional manufacturing labor intensive towards probably the more innovative digital businesses that allow for remote working and all of this, because rather than just competing in the small, low margin businesses. And secondly, I think we very vaguely touched upon female labor participation rates. So I recognize that that is still drastically low, and it's actually been fluctuating in the past years, and at points has dropped down. So, and if you look at the reasons for it, it differs from rural to urban. So what are possible policy measures to address that issue?
Let's take that first one as comment. Second one, I think, we'll so that I give chance to others in the back. Okay, next we will come here. Sorry? Yeah, then there's Viral, we'll come to Viral.
Yeah, first of all, it is a very fascinating session. We covered so many points. I'm not quite sure where to start, but I probably will react to a couple of things. One, what Dr. Panagariya had brought up in terms of a potential, the very first question of yours that's hard to find answers to, which is the realpolitik, or possible realpolitik of people, politicians and others would like to retain that electoral base. Recently, I was traveling in rural southern India, in Tamil Nadu, actually, eastern and southern parts of Tamil Nadu. I actually saw the villages are kind of more or less emptying. The epicenter of activity has basically been Chennai and neighborhood. So essentially with the automobile manufacturing, IT, ITES, and so on. So much so that very recent article, I think in New York Times, which said about nearly 2/3 of women who work in factories are actually in Tamil Nadu, which that maps onto only essentially Chennai and the near neighborhood. The other thing I noticed was they've been migrating towards the western Tamil Nadu, which is the garment thing he talked about, Tirupur and Coimbatore and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of you made a point about South Korea. That's happening, I think, more at the state level as opposed to across state lines. That's one. Yes. Secondly, the other sort of realpolitik, again, is that talking about the performance-linked incentive, a very good point made by Dr. Gupta in terms of how do you manage the fiscal side of it. More importantly, I often think, even in this country, once incentives are given, it's very difficult to take them back. So I would be more worried about that than the fiscal part of it. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Both very good points. And Tamil Nadu, you are absolutely right that transformation is certainly much faster than in the average of India. Here. Can we bring the microphone? Yeah, please. No, wait 1 second. It's coming.
Yeah, this is on. Yeah. As I think about the next decade, and looking back, for example, at the shared services, IT, enabled services industry that's built up in India over the last, 2 to 3 decades. We have about 6 million or more workers. Maybe that's a small percentage. But, with generative AI, with AI, I've been sort of in this field for a bit. And it's very apparent to me that 30 to 50% of what we are currently doing in these shared services and in all these sort of IT-enabled services industry can be automated. We don't need people doing it. I mean, we've run a lot of experiments as part of the organization I was involved in, where you could do stuff that people were doing in 90 minutes and 3.5 minutes, and this was 20 years ago. Stuff has moved on. So what worries me is as I look forward, And the only thing I think that's holding it back is change management. It's about people and their resistance to change, which is usually the biggest issue when it comes to adoption of technology. It's not that technology doesn't exist, that can't automate a lot of stuff we do. It's because people aren't ready for it and there's resistance. So as we look at the next 10 years or the next decade, how does India sort of protect itself? Because I think this is inevitable. It's a matter of time. We might have middle generations who are there right now. How do we protect ourselves in India? And what do we generate instead to sort of create something new? Because part of a lot of what's being done right now is very automatable. And I've seen that over the last 2 decades. But we just haven't gone there yet.
So we'll come to you for that in a second. Let me take Viral.
Yeah, thank you for a great panel. A lot of interesting data and charts, much to mull over. I have just one question. I was surprised, Arvind, you didn't bring it up, so I'm bringing it up myself, which is, I wonder if the ultimate problem in India is the tariffs, which are protecting our manufacturing firms. I think they're too high, so they're like artificially guarding them from international products competition. And this makes it very attractive for the best businessmen in the country to capture the local industry. They have physical assets. They can borrow from banks this way, and at least until recently, they've not been held that accountable for not always managing payments, etc. And I think it also explains 2 other things, which is that, we are creating jobs, but not fast enough. And the only way out is that we have to export more. We have to manufacture for the rest of the world, but that's not what our manufacturers are doing for most part, barring a few exceptions in auto, in a few segments of auto ancillaries. And I think the second thing it explains is also the divergence between the stock market and the real economy in parts. I was giving fintech as one explanation. But the other explanation is that the domestic manufacturers have fat margins. They are all making, they are doing very well. It's just that they are not creating enough jobs that the country needs. So I wonder if somehow we need a transformative reform which says, listen, over the next 3 years, we are opening up our manufacturing to foreign companies by lowering tariffs, effectively to foreign products by lowering tariffs. And maybe our biggest tigers will go into services and create a ton of jobs. Anyway, I'm posing it as a question, which is, do we need to push the government to do away with such high tariffs? That's my question.
Yeah, I think maybe I'll take that question, and I certainly agree with you. That is certain. There's been a long-standing battle that I've been fighting. But I certainly believe that one way that this tariff, high tariff kind of works badly is that in effect it gives rise to these small enterprises. The smallness is encouraged by because particularly when you have this kind of complex tariff structure, the effective tariff protection sometimes can be extremely high. Particularly if the inputs are coming in with much lower tariffs, and the assembly is subject to even 20% tariff, it translates into really very huge protection. So most inefficient enterprises can actually successfully, in those sectors at least, compete. And so you do encourage smaller firms and inefficient firms. So certainly, by the way, on that, just to partly further reinforce, when India grew very rapidly starting in 2003, it did actually expand its trade massively between 2003 and 2012. Exports just for merchandise went up 6 times. So from 50 billion, they went to 300 billion. And services exports, of course, expanded even faster. The base is lower, but they expanded even faster. So certainly, it didn't hurt us at all to liberalize. But that is something, that has been very hard, difficult. Last time we liberalized tariffs was 2007-8. That was the last time, from 12.5. the top tariff rate went from 12.5 to 10%. With some exceptions, like auto is overly protected, and textiles and clothing is also protected and so forth. But largely, otherwise, the top tariff rates was brought to 10% in 7-8, and then it stopped. And of course, in 2018-19, we really massively raised the tariffs back. Difficult battle, I think. There's been I've been probably the lone fighter on this with not very good results so far. But I certainly empathize and sympathize with that. Raj, for the other question.
I have a very quick question, and I would like the panel and the participants to picture, the pandemic exodus of essential workers and how it informed your research development. And if you have time later, I can share some solutions and resources. Thank you.
I'll answer the AI question. So I totally agree. I think in the short term, but even in the long term, what we call the codifiable jobs will be replaced. But having said that, there'll be lots of opportunities, since we are in the optimism panel, that will be created. And we keep comparing ourselves with China. I would say China has a huge head start in things like facial recognition and autonomous vehicles. And that's an opportunity for the Indian IT industry to catch up. But on your specific question of what jobs can be done, I would say in the short term, there are lots of gig jobs, such as M-Turkers trying to just create training data sets. I think Indians can do that job really well. In the longer term, I think the sense is that new jobs and new occupations will get created, like social media influencers did not exist as an occupation 5 years back or even 10 years back. So now that's a legitimate, career option for a young person. So, I would say new jobs will get created, and let's dominate the AI space, given the fact that we've been in IT for 30 years.
I like that. We'll take 2 more questions, and then we close the session. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thank you so much for such an interesting panel. See, historically speaking, we have been studying, right from French Revolution, Industrial Revolution, that jobs are all created in the urban centers. People have migrated from the rural centers to the urban centers. And where we have industrial hubs, we have cities, we have, activity happening. So in this context, I've been thinking about the gift city in Gujarat, which is a special economic zone where government has given a lot of tax deductions and, attracting investments for the country, attracting companies there. So just a data that I was studying about gift city was around, for the past few years since inception, around 10,000 to 15,000 jobs have been created in these centers. So could you just throw light on this fact that what justifies the creation of these centers where we're not being able to create jobs and having such centers in the city, in the country?
Okay. That was...
Thank you for such a incisive data and research that was brought to the discussion. My question is specifically to Ms. Poonam. Ma'am, in your presentation, you highlighted about the employability of the skilled labor force in India. And if you talk about the lot of incentives or schemes that government has come up in the last 30 years to boost manufacturing, one specific aspect that probably needs to be highlighted is, in spite of so many schemes have been brought by government, the companies that are actually involved in, say, advanced manufacturing or low-scale, large-scale manufacturing, they invest a lot of training cost in order to make the labor force skilled. And they also face a double whammy in terms of a very high attrition cost. Like a lot of people immediately leave within a very short span of time. So in order to position our country as a manufacturing hub in terms of cost competitiveness, in terms of logistics and all, what specific role you feel that the ITIs or the vocational schools would have to play in the coming decade to, change this entire narrative with regards to improving the manufacturing landscape? Thank you.
So I think it's the right time to now bring my experiences as an employer in Delhi in a knowledge firm. So we are an institution of 120. At any given point in time, we have at least 10 vacancies which we cannot fill. So that's the optimism that Mr. Raj talked about. And what are the reasons? Labor laws do impact us. They are in a gray area that we are a service industry, so do labor laws apply or not? And there are sister concerns which have tried to fire people in the past, and for the past 30 years, they're contesting court cases. So what we have done is we don't hire permanent employees now anymore. We hire people on 3-year contracts. For some of the talent, I'm increasing that to 5-year contracts. And so we have 3 kinds of people we hire. One are 3-year contracts. Then we hire what we call consultants. And third is third party. Third party people are the lowest protected. They are the employee of somebody else, but we bring them to work with us. So our code word is third party means only a 1-month notice, and that notice we don't have to give. Somebody else gives. We just inform the firm, we don't need the person, and that's it. We are not supposed to be taking regular work from these people, and we take regular work. So we can get in trouble, actually, for that. People who are highly skilled, we don't worry about them. You tell them it's not working out, they go find somebody else, something else. These are the people at lower and middle end skills that resist. So I talked about emotional, something being an emotional issue, farming and so on. Similarly, if an individual has worked at an institution for a few years, and you try to lay that person off, many people, not the whole institution, comes and asks why. So it's not just the formal labor law. You have to be very careful about keeping the peace within. So the other thing that you mentioned is skill mismatch. Why are we not able to fill these 10 positions? We don't get the right skills. We get the right years of education, but not the skills, right? It's easier for us to assess based on the years and where the education has been obtained to assess a highly skilled economist. But anything other than that, be an accountant, be a HR individual, be an IT individual, we look at the application, and we do get hundreds of applications, and we use all modes and platform and Naukri.com, etc. With great difficulty, we shortlist a few people, we interview those people, and ultimately we train those people. And we don't have those skills ourselves, that's why we are hiring. We are not a very large institution. Absolutely right. Within a year, that person becomes so employable that then it becomes hard for us to retain that person. So we go through it all. So we didn't talk about skills, we didn't talk about the demand-supply mismatch, just 2 more things. We were talking about hiring locally versus nationally. So when it comes to high-skilled people, we do get applications from all over India. Anything else, we call them non-research jobs. We only get local applications. So the markets are very localized. Any middle-level person is hard to train and is the least mobile. So it's much more complicated than what we are discussing. It's service is the largest employer, services sector. And there the skill issue is a big one. Years of education is not equal to skills.
All right, we'll bring this to a close. Thank you all for being such a good audience and for your participation. Excellent questions and comments from all of you. And of course, 3 cheers for our panelists. Please join me in thanking them.